7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
Silence is not empty. In the Judean desert, it is memory. For 2 millennia, a cleft in the rocks, halfway down a jagged cliff in Nahal Hever, kept its silence. Archaeologists call it the Cave of Horror, not for what was found, but for why it was there. Inside were the bones of 40 refugees, families who fled the Roman purge during the Bar Kokhba revolt. They didn't die fighting, they died waiting. No records, no messages, just dust, death, and fragments of parchment. Torn, smeared, illegible. Scholars thought they were nothing, scraps. But fragments speak in ways even ink cannot. When researchers returned in 2021, they didn't come searching for revelation. They came to prevent looting. But what they found was not just archaeology. It was a cry. Among the bones, crumpled and brittle, were verses from the prophet Nahum in Greek. Yet in the middle of foreign language and imperial syntax, one thing stood untouched: the name of God, Yahweh. Written not in Greek, but in ancient Hebrew script. A whisper, untranslated, unconquered. This wasn't translation, it was defiance. And it raised a question no one could answer with certainty. Why would a people facing death preserve the divine name in their own language while letting everything else fall into the empire's tongue? The cave hadn't gone silent. It had been speaking all along, but no one was listening, until now. Greek was not their mother tongue, but it was the language of the world that ruled them. The scroll fragments found in the Cave of Horror were not written in Hebrew or Aramaic, the sacred tongues of prophets and priests. They were copied in Greek, the language of government, of Rome's clenched grip. And yet, even here, the name of Yahweh remained in Hebrew, carved into foreign text like a buried anthem. Why? Why copy sacred scripture into the words of your oppressors, but leave the name of God untouched? It wasn't carelessness, it was calculated. These weren't scribes in synagogues. These were families in hiding. Elders, children, rebels, maybe starving, maybe wounded, choosing to write not from memory, but for identity. They knew they wouldn't survive, but they needed the message too. And the message wasn't simply the words of Nahum or Zechariah. It was the handwriting itself. The strokes were unstable, jagged, trembling. Letters weren't formed by studied calligraphy. They were written by hands that shook, not from cold, from fear. "The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished," one line read. It wasn't copied, it was chosen. This wasn't a Bible in hiding. It was a code of survival, written in the language of the empire, with a heart that still beat in Hebrew.
Were these people writing to future generations or to the heavens themselves? There are no names in the Cave of Horror, only handwriting. But AI read their fear, and that fear spoke louder than their silence. Each stroke, curve, and ink variation was logged, not just for reconstruction, but for psychological mapping. It was the first time sacred texts were read as trauma. What emerged was a picture of communal desperation. This wasn't one scribe writing quietly by lamplight. It was a family, a community, a remnant. One fragment began in a childlike hand, another finished with steady pressure, an elder perhaps. AI detected inconsistent ink pressure, lines restarted, pens dipped again mid-verse. These weren't stylistic errors, they were physical indicators of someone weary, weak, or possibly dying. And still, they wrote. Not everything, just what mattered. They chose the prophecies that declared return, justice, and restoration. Not laws, not genealogies, but hope. Not a Bible, a farewell. What if the scrolls weren't sacred because of the words, but because of the hands that dared to write them? Every letter in the scrolls could fade, but the name of Yahweh remained, always in Hebrew, always untouched. The AI confirmed this pattern across all analyzed fragments. No matter the language, whether Greek or Aramaic, the Tetragrammaton appeared in its ancient Hebrew form. It was more than reverence, it was resistance. In a world collapsing under Roman boots, where names were changed and languages imposed, these scribes clung to a single truth. This name is not yours to conquer. Every time they wrote the sacred name, they wrote it differently, bigger, stronger. Sometimes it was the only clear word on the page. This was not piety. This was ownership. It echoed Exodus, when Moses asked, "Who shall I say sent me?" And God answered, "I am." That "I am" had not been translated, not in these caves, not ever. Even as the rest of the scroll bowed to empire, the name did not. Could 4 Hebrew letters hold back an entire empire? We thought they were sacred archives, but the scrolls were something else entirely. They were written hastily, without ceremony, no jars, no seals, just scattered among the dead. AI analysis revealed many were unfinished. Some were copies of copies, incomplete, fragmented. And yet, they carried the weight of Scripture. Why? Because they weren't trying to preserve tradition. They were trying to preserve themselves. Each fragment was a shield of words, a defense not of swords or armies, but of memory. The scrolls weren't meant to be found. They were meant to be hidden, in case someone, somewhere, survived long enough to read them. A legacy, not of power, but of pain. And the message, encoded in ink and sealed by fear, was simple. We were here. We believed. We wrote. How many verses were never meant for us, only for the dying hands that dared to write them? AI didn't just scan parchment, it resurrected voices. As the algorithms pieced together shattered fragments, it became clear this wasn't an archive. It was a mass confession. Each stroke was logged, each deviation measured, and what emerged was not one scroll, but many confessions from many hands written in many tones. The machine found verses repeated across fragments, like echoes. As if the writers didn't just want to copy, they wanted to remember. The phrase, "The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished," appeared more than once, across different hands, different strokes, always with emphasis. As if they were etching a promise into eternity, not for Rome, not for scholars, but for heaven. The AI couldn't explain why they chose those verses, but it showed that they did. And now, 2,000 years later, we can read what they thought would never be heard. Not scripture, not doctrine, but the sound of people choosing to hope, even as the cave became their grave. What else still waits in silence, until the machines are ready to listen? They weren't scribes, they were survivors. And the scrolls weren't written to teach, they were written to endure. Every decoded letter, every AI-rendered line brought us closer to understanding one truth. This was not about preservation. It was about protest. Against empire. Against erasure. Against the silence of history. They didn't ask to be remembered, but they wrote anyway. And now their story is being told, not in temples, not on scrolls of gold, but on frayed parchment, decoded by algorithms, spoken through machines. Their God was not forgotten. Their name was not erased. And their scrolls, born of fear, sealed in horror, have now become the loudest whisper in biblical archaeology. The cave is still there. The bones are still there. But now, so is the voice. And it's still speaking. Not loudly, not perfectly, but clearly enough to change everything we thought we knew. The stones are shifting. The name is intact. And somewhere between the code and the dust, prophecy waits to be finished.